Hi folks, Lou here, and I am going to talk, perhaps at some length, about the game Axis and Allies and why it has so little to do with history and generalship. And of course, it's a mass market game, not a hobby game, so you'd expect it to be farther along that axis from realistic, let's say, to unrealistic. But it goes pretty far, and I don't know that it was necessary to go that far, but it did. Now, in general, the reason why is that there's a lack of constraints in Axis and Allies, the kinds of constraints that make a big difference in real war. Now, of course, I maintain that war games, at least tabletop war games, do not reflect warfare. At best, they reflect generalship to some extent, although even there's a big dichotomy because generals have to deal with very uncertain situations, and yet game players want much more knowledge of what's going on. And the very first obvious thing in Axis and Allies is there's no hidden anything. Everything is available to the enemy, all information. And that's nothing like a real war. Another limitation that is lacking is logistical limitations. Napoleon is said to have said, amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. And you get generals like Rommel who evidently didn't understand logistics very well or tried to ignore them, and it didn't work. Logistics, of course, being essentially supplying the troops so they can do something. Well, there's none of that in Axis and Allies. There are no supply lines at all. And if you study real warfare, you find supply lines are very, very, very important in modern days. Not so much if you go back to the ancients, where they could forage and supply themselves pretty well. But that's not practical in more modern warfare, and you need to have supplies coming in, and you need to have secure supply lines. That's not in the game. A consequence of this lack of logistics and supply is everyone moves at once. In real warfare, you can't do that. You don't have enough supplies to do that. You've got to decide where you're going to put your great effort, and everybody else is pretty much going to sit there and not do anything unusual or new. They're just going to defend. You don't have that in a great many war games, and certainly not in Axis and Allies. Another limitation that is lacking is the war of submarines on commerce. Yes, there's something there, but practically speaking, it doesn't matter. And yet, as I recall, Winston Churchill said, the only thing that really worried him during the war was the Battle of the Atlantic, the submarine battles. But submarine battles are not examples of generalship. They're a matter of attrition and technique. And a big example of technique, this from World War I, is that for some ungodly reason, the British, who had used the convoy system in their previous wars, did not use a convoy system until 1917. And that cost them a vast number of ships. And once they instituted the convoy system, they were winning the Battle of the Atlantic in World War I. Another example of technique is escort carriers that could go out in the middle of Atlantic and fly air cover and keep the submarines underneath the water, where they were much less effective. Submarines normally attacked on the surface at night. Or if there were no escorts around, they could attack on the surface in the daytime because the transports couldn't do anything about it. None of that is depicted in the game. Another big lack of constraint is that the economy is what I call a cumulative economy rather than a maintenance economy. In other words, you just accumulate more and more units. You don't have to pay anything for the existing units. And yet there's no other way that the number of units you have is limited. Now, in my game Britannia, for example, it's also a cumulative economy, but there's overpopulation rules. so that at some point you can't build any more armies because you don't have enough areas to support them. Cumulative economies are unrealistic. There's no other way around it. And you generally see cumulative economies in mass market games like Risk, for example, and you sometimes see them in more advanced games or more games that are hobby games. And partly that's because a cumulative economy is easy to keep track of. A maintenance economy means you have to count the existing units before you can figure out what you can build, because you've got to pay for those existing units. So you've got to have a game that doesn't have very many units, or else you're going to spend an awful lot of time counting up your units. Another and minor problem is that you can use transports to soak up the hits in sea battles. And of course, that didn't happen generally. I could go on about other things, but in the end, what you have with Axis and Allies is an experience with plastic soldiers, not a game that's likely to teach a whole lot about the real world, and that doesn't reflect the real world. But it's a mass market game. You don't worry about those things generally, and it's certainly been a very successful game. Partly, I think, because it's a dice fest, but that's a topic for another time. Thanks for listening.